This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobby.
The Archives.
Episode 162. An economic model that includes energy.
Economics is still built around the same factors of production that Adam Smith was going on about centuries ago: land, labour and capital. But what about energy? You can't have machines without energy. You can't have humans working without energy. So isn't that a bit of a problem? Fortunately, Steve Keen is working on reworking the basis of economic theory and modelling by incorporating the one crucial element that's been missed out, or at best marginalised: energy. Today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So Steve is, we believe, the first economist to properly incorporate the role of energy into economic theory. And on this, he's been working with Tim Garrett, Associate Professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Utah, and Matheus Grasselli, Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at McMaster University in Hamilton in Canada. And today we're going to try and get up to speed on their research. I guess a starting point, Steve, I mean, how do most economists treat energy? Do they ignore it? I mean, certainly if you look at the Cobb-Douglas model, which goes back to the 1920s, which could be seen as being a little out of date. But I mean, if we look at the two basic factors of production, labour and capital, I mean, that doesn't even consider feeding your workers or powering your machines. Capital is magically self-perpetuating, isn't it?
Oh, there's all sorts of issues in the definition of capital. And look, if you go back far enough, and I mean, my age is old enough these days, when I did my undergraduate, they would talk about factors of production in your first year macro and micro course, and it would be land, labour, enterprise and capital, four of them. Now, as time has gone on, the neoclassicals have slowly, even though they will say if you put them under stress, which is basically asking them a question, put them under stress, they'll say that we still incorporate that's implicitly in the
land.
Capital, the capital. Land is like capital. It's easy to make a new piece of land. Just, go and do and dredge what the Dutch do, what the Dutch have done. I'm sitting on a piece of newly made land, 500 years old. But it's because it's nonsense. The land has got fundamentally different aspects to it than the machinery. And also in that sense, so does enterprise.
But wouldn't they say that land energy is part of that land though? So it's a land choice, isn't it? Whether you have put a coal power plant or crops for fuel or solar or wind farms, they all take up land, and the availability of that land and the ability to extract energy from it determines the price of that energy as an input, doesn't it?
They will waffle around it, but that's actually takes me back to my favorite group of economists, which is actually the physiocrats who predate Smith. And when you see what they were talking about, coming from rural France, at that stage, France was UK had already begun an industrialization process using peat, wind power to some extent, mainly water power. And so there are manufacturing processes certainly in Scotland before the intervention of the steam engine by Watt. But at the time that Smith was working in Scotland and the physiocrats were working in France was far more rural. And so the physiocratic idea was that all production comes from the land, all wealth comes from the land. And their argument was that the land was what they called fertile because it got, quote unquote, the free gift of nature. Now, the free gift of nature is another way to describe energy. And in fact, when you look at the linguistic history of the word energy, it was only invented by, I've forgotten who, but a English polymath in 1809. So you can actually say the free gift of energy is the physiocrats saying all wealth comes from energy. And they were right. Now, Smith jumps into the window. The beauty about working from the agriculture point of view, that's obvious that when you plant a seed and you get back a plant, one seed becomes 10,000 seeds, and on goes the process. So the object is reproducing itself, and the only thing you can say that's actually helping us out is nature's doing something for free, which is precisely the way that the physiocrats spoke about it. Now, Smith comes over and he then says, no, it's not the land that's producing this, it's the division of labour, which we are starting to see, of course, in the classic example of the pin factory that Smith gives in The Wealth of Nations. But it was much more obvious that something was coming out of manufacturing, which the physiocrats described as a sterile sector. They said they simply took whatever wealth was created courtesy of the free gift of nature in agriculture and converted it to something else. So the stylized model that's the most famous physiocratic model is the tableau économique, by Quenet back in the late 1700s, predating Smith. And in that table, he had with his idea of what was being produced in the manufacturing sector were carriages. So the corn was produced in the agricultural sector. That's where the wealth was generated. That's where the real wealth came from. Some of that corn was then used to convert into carriages, which of course you were selling to the proprietor class. So in that sense, the physiocrats not only had it right on what the source of wealth was, which was converting energy into useful work. They also had a class division, which included the proprietors on top benefiting out of the taking care of that not surplus, but they were the main beneficiaries owning the land of the exploitation of the free gift of labour, free gift of land. And Smith gives us the idea of the labour and division of labour, and we call it the labour theory of value, and then the neoclassical response to that. And we've wasted about 200 bloody years. And I'm not joking. I mean, that's when I write my magnum opus, I'm going to be calling Smith the person to lead economics astray, not the foundation of the
Yeah. And yet, when you look at this link between growth and energy, I mean, economists might not realize it, but I mean, certainly the international markets, investors realize it. I know you don't like that word, investors, but if you look at, if energy consumption falls, and we're seeing a fall in energy demand right now, the expectation is, isn't it, that the economy is going to weaken, that GDP is going to fall, and conversely, we're seeing all this concern over China trade talks failing. Demand for oil is falling as a result of that because it's an obvious relationship. There's less demand for stuff, less energy needed to make stuff. So the markets react to that.
Yeah, and then that's a sensible reaction. Whereas the economic theory, if you look at how the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is the way neoclassicals, the simple way they modify, they use what they call constant elasticity substitution functions as well, which are much more complicated and which can map between a fixed ratio of labour to capital to a variable one by changing exponents. But the fundamental argument is still this Cobb-Douglas production function, that you take labour and capital and combine them and you produce output. And if they try to bring energy in, then what the first neoclassicals doing this did was say, well, this labour is a factor of production, capital is a factor of production, energy is a factor of production. And we used to add, here we have L, K, and E as the arguments to the function. And the rate that we apply, which is where we work out what exponents we put on top of to these inputs to maintain the sensible concept of constant returns to scale, meaning if you double all inputs, if you double inputs, you double all outputs. So therefore there has to be a limit on the value of your exponents. And the value they'd use for energy is the proportion of the industry, the GDP, which you can source to energy. And in America, it's about 7%. What it argued effectively was 70% of change in output, therefore, came from from labour. 23%, I'll say 63 to 70%. Let's stick with 63%. 63% came from labour, 30% from capital, and 7% from energy. And I saw one of the few times I'll quote Larry Summers favourably is that he was having, in talking about his secular stagnation explanation for the aftermath of the financial crisis, he made a crack about how a bunch of Chicago economists, if the energy sector shut down completely, they'd be writing papers explaining, well, this can only affect most 7% of GDP. Yeah. Of course, if energy shut down completely, that'd be the end of the economy. So, and
if we move to automation, then you're getting rid of the labour element out of all of that. By and large.
No, they can't even do that because they relate the scope exponents to the share of wages and national income. So even though it's declined, it's still of the order of 60%. Right. So they're still arguing that most of the change in output comes from labour. Now, I always regard that these as something seriously wrong with these ideas. And I wasn't happy with the idea of adding energy as the third factor because it implied you could set a bomb off in a factory and that would improve output. If you add labour as an independent factor and capital as an independent factor and energy as an independent factor, then you've got a worker using his or her hands, a machine cutting pieces of metal in a very careful way, and an explosion. Didn't make any sense at all. So my simple insight was to say, well, labour without capital, labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. So rather than having energy as the third argument, independent, energy was an input into the other two. very, very different forms of energy, of course, but labor takes energy and creates useful work. Machinery takes an energy and creates useful work, and the two are necessary working together. But the energy is an input to both, and if the energy is zero, then the output is zero.
Right, but they have constraints, of course, don't they? So the amount of food is determined by land, and assuming the sun continues to shine, the amount of land that we're giving over to crops and food production, and I guess land. We do get to the importance of land again, because that also applies for how you use that land for the creation of energy to power your machines.
Yeah, you can actually see land in that sense as a form of energy. And that's, or an energy recipient, an energy processor, because the land is receiving the sun, and the sun, which we don't, nobody, so far as I know, built. That is why you talk about being free energy, because you didn't pay for the actual source of the energy in the first instance.
So we get back to that, that rudimentary model of land, labor, and capital. My point earlier on, isn't land covering energy in that case?
It is, but not as explicitly. And that's why I'm saying you've got to explicitly have it inside there. And that's what we've done. And that's my own contribution to that. The contribution so what that meant was, rather than saying labor and capital and energy are independent factors of production, which is the way it's put in a Cobb-Douglas framework, or saying that land, labor, and capital together produce output, which is the approach that post-Keynesians have used, and fundamentally see a constant relationship between labor and capital, saying labor and capital both take in energy, and the simplest way to illustrate that is to say that the energy output of labor is the number of workers times the number of calories they process times the efficiency with which that work is turned into useful work. And pardon me, machinery, similar thing, but much greater scale.
Right. So actually putting in specific inputs, price inputs for energy into the model.
Well, that's a later stage, but the starting point is simply acknowledging it in the first place and saying that the output of machinery is, in inverted commas, number of machines times the energy processing capability of each representative machine at a particular point in time, times the efficiency with which that's converted into useful work. And that then says that what production is fundamentally doing is taking advantage of free energy to produce useful work and turning that useful work in energy terms into widgets. And that's that was my contribution to this innovation. But I was the first economist to do it properly, not the first person. And that's where Tim Garrett's work comes in. Pardon me, mate. And so Tim's was approaching it from a thermodynamic point of view. His main interest, and you're going to love this, is the mathematics of snowflakes.
Right.
Okay. So he works at how do snowflakes form. And that, of course, is a serious question in meteorology, and it's a serious question in climate analysis as well. And what he basically said was that a snowflake starts to form when a bit of dust interacts with a bit of moisture in the air, and then forms a tiny crystalline structure. Now, all the beautiful snowflakes that you see in photographs of snowflakes are 1 in a billion of the actual snowflakes. When Tim actually takes the real thing, they're nothing like these gorgeous little uniform structures we see. But what he saw was the way that they grew involved the scale of the interface. So if you think about the interface to a droplet of water, the droplet of water with some dust inside it that is under cold enough conditions to turn into a snowflake, that has a interface. Its volume is r cubed, radius of the snowflake cubed. Its area is r squared. But it turns out, and I do not understand this is thermodynamics behind it rather than any simple scales. The effective interface is the length of the snowflake. And what that gave him is an argument that the length of the interface between an energy source and an energy sink is what enables a snowflake to form. So he applied exactly the same logic to manufacturing and said that what's going on is we have an energy source, which is coal deposits, oil deposits, et cetera, an interface with society, meaning we have the mines that exploit these products and enable us to turn them into energy sources for our machines. Society, which is then powered by this effectively waterfall of energy from where it is at high potential to where we've taken advantage of that gap at a lower potential. That's where the economy operates, and the economy needs this waterfall of energy to be falling in all the time to enable that work to be done. And then to actually enable this useful work as well, we've got to dump that waste into a lower level again, which is the environment. And so you get a combination between the energy source, the productive use of that giving a society, and dumping it into the environment from a thermodynamic point of view. And that Tim did that, I think, back in about 2012 or maybe even earlier.
And that sort of makes sense. I don't know too much about the law of thermodynamics, so I get a little lost here. I mean, in my mind, I've always thought the law of thermodynamics, and this is the extent of it, so don't laugh. I just thought this is the science's way of saying we can't have perpetual motion. We can't have a self-sustaining planet. We've got the sun, which provides an input, but it's not going to burn forever. But hopefully, it's going to burn for long enough. But we also create pollution back on our planet, or we create carbon, and our atmosphere can only hold so much. So I sort of look at it as a bit like you're saying, a system of inputs, but it can't create forever, because there's limitations, just as you can't have perpetual motion.
Yeah, and that's the point of coming from a thermodynamic point of view. You automatically acknowledge that straight away, that you can't have production without waste.
Yeah,
and that is like when I teach my students about it, I fundamentally start from a point of view of the idea of a potential energy, saying that if you have a waterfall which is powering a water mill, then for the waterfall to work, the height of the waterfall must be higher than the height of the lake into which it's pouring. If the height's the same, there's no potential energy to be exploited, and you won't be able to turn the water mill, and you won't be able to produce any energy, and you won't be able to do any work. And then equally, once you've got that done, the amount of energy you can exploit is not the entire available energy, because if the entire available energy, the depth of the well into which the water was falling would need to hit the center of the planet. So there's in that sense, there's wasted potential energy. You could measure the potential energy relative to the core of the planet versus what you actually get, and it's a damn sight less. And the same thing applies if you think about like a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant or anything of that nature. To exploit the energy, they've got to dump the waste heat back into the environment. So you're operating at 1,000 degrees Celsius, let's say. That'd be a pretty high temperature. Then you've got to actually, if you've had it completely sealed, the whole thing would even out to 1,000 degrees centigrade, and you wouldn't have any. There'd be nothing turning. So you've got to be dumping the waste heat, and what are you dumping into? An environment which has a background in terms of Kelvin temperature, about 300 Kelvin. So you can exploit 700 Kelvin of your energy, not 1,000 Kelvin. And therefore, of course, if you're dumping into a reservoir which is not particularly large compared to your source, and this is the problem for power stations using water to cool the energy, then you're going to raise the local temperature. And as you raise the local temperature, you reduce the efficiency of your energy extraction.
And this is all so far removed, isn't it, from the Cobb-Douglas model? Unless you were to say, well, okay, land, actually, let's call land the environment, and let's have some sort of feedback loop where actually the more you produce, the more you're degrading that environment. Yeah, so it's not a finite resource.
Yeah, and this is, again, why I look at what neoclassicals have done in terms of their ecological modeling, and they've really done bugger all about the production side of the function. They simply have a damage function dividing a Cobb-Douglas production function. And there's no relationship between the damage and the capital goods themselves or the labour itself. Production goes on willy-nilly. That's certainly the case in Nordhaus's model. A couple of the others are slightly more complicated, but they haven't put energy in any essential way. So I wasn't going to tackle climate change until I'd worked out a way of doing it. And that's what I did 2 or 3 years ago. And now working with Tim, courtesy of a grant from the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK, of £60,000, mediated by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, which are the ones who are managing the Rebuilding Macroeconomics project of the ESRC. So the grant, they've got to acknowledge my sponsors, and I'm happy to do it. That's where the payment came together to enable myself and Matheus and Tim to spend a week trying to brainstorm and see how they can take them from the basic initial ideas to some models of economic and production and waste.
Right. So this is a model basically coming up with a new equation, in effect, a new economic model that is more realistic in representing how things really work, getting that relationship between energy use and pollution and economic growth. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah, like we did this. The background that both Matheus and I have, we both work using what's called the Goodwin model, which sees production it's called the Leontief production function, and that's the common one used by post-Keynesian economists. This is that output is not this easily variable inputs of labour and capital, which is the neoclassical idea, but you can say output is labour productivity multiplied by labour, which is also equal to the utilization of capacity of the amount of your machinery utilizing, multiplied by the amount of machinery you have, divided by a capital output ratio. And we simply took that and said, well, let's put this in energy terms. The energy input of labor is the number of workers times the calories times the efficiency of conversion. Ditto for machines, of course, a much larger number, and unbounded in the sense that if you can make a machine take in more energy, then it'll produce, to start finding a machine, say, as a rail engine, you'll get more goods and services out of that, being transportation in that case, if you can get more energy into the train. And comparing the trains today of trains to back in the days, the James Watt engine, obviously that's what we've done. So the major source of increase in production is increasing harnessing of energy. And that's just a more realistic start. But of course, it leads to all sorts of complications in how you try to put it into a economic model.
Yeah, because it's not. I mean, that relationship between the output and the inputs in terms of energy use is not. It's not a linear relationship, is it? I mean, if you stop feeding someone, like the more you feed someone, they don't become more productive. In fact, there's a point at which you can, if you only feed them half as much, they're still going to be useless because they're going to have difficulty getting out of bed. And it's the same with machines, isn't it? That you're going to get to a point where perhaps you need a small increment of energy use because the machines get more efficient, perhaps because of their size, so you get economies of scale, or because we've made big developments, big strides, like we have with aircraft, for example, doing the same job but using less fuel, that sort of thing.
Well, there's all sorts of issues that turn up there. But yes, the fundamental thing about labour, and this is why another reason to reject the labour theory of value, and that is that the energy output of labour is pretty heavily capped at something of the order of 100 calories, which is about the power of an old-fashioned light bulb. That's about the amount of energy a worker can put in. And you're thinking in terms of unskilled workers, which I define as workers who could be trained to use the current machinery, but they couldn't invent the machinery themselves or make the machinery. That's the definition of unskilled labour, and the output is of the order of 80 between 70 and 120 watts. So about the power
and I can
range.
vouch for that. I can vouch for that because when I'm there, pacing and sweating at the gym, and you do that for half an hour, you get to the end, you're exhausted, and then it tells you how much you've used, and basically, you've used enough to power that light bulb for half an hour.
That's right. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, if you get a machine, if you can produce a machine that does the same mechanical motions as the worker was doing previously, then you start off with a particular level of power you can get into the machine, but you get your technologist at it over time, and that rises dramatically. So, my favorite comparison of the amount of what that then says is the amount of output is related to the amount of energy. And this is actually a point where my stuff and Tim's differs in a way which is extremely important. So I want to come back to that. But I got a relationship, therefore, between the amount of energy going in and the amount of GDP. And if you think about my archetypal machine from Adam Smith's time is of course the James Watt steam engine, which was manufactured about 7 years after I think Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. That machine, when it was put into a transportation device, used about 10 tons of energy per day, 10 tons of coal in that case. My fanboy, one of my two fanboy effects, Elon Musk, the Falcon 9, I think it's the Falcon 9, not the Falcon 9 Heavy. The Falcon 9 Heavy uses 9 tons of fuel a second. So what you've got is a 25,000 times increase in the amount of energy being devoted into the service called transportation. And that's what I see as the main form of the increase in wealth over time.
So there must be other factors, though. I mean, we can't dismiss all those other factors, like the role of labor. You're converting to energy, but land, capital obviously is still a factor because you're powering something, and you've got to have money for that.
Something to power.
You've got to have something to power. And entrepreneurship, which is the other one, isn't it? Which is basically how efficiently you're using all of these tools.
No, entrepreneur. That's actually one of my favorite distinctions between entrepreneur and a manager was made by Schumpeter, and he said that an entrepreneur is like somebody who builds a road, and a manager is like somebody who walks down it. So entrepreneurship is a totally different thing. It's changing how you do something rather than
But I think that's sort of my point that how efficiently you're doing stuff is determined by entrepreneurship. And so they're still a factors, and somehow they've got to be part of the model as well. You don't just have a piece of equipment and energy inputs, and you just keep on powering that machine. Someone's got to be there to say there's got to be a better way of doing this.
Yeah, but also, like, one thing I keep on getting from people whenever I raise this issue of using energy as the fundamental cause of production as well. What about computer software services and stuff like that? What's the relationship? What about an artist? Does Picasso's art cost more than your local street painter because Picasso paints the walls faster, et cetera, et cetera? That's the second or third order issue. The first thing is explaining how you get the walls painted. There are parts of it, and this is where Ricardo is very good in saying some things simply aren't priced courtesy of the cost of production because they are unique. They can't be reproduced. So we're talking about reproducible objects, not unique ones. Yeah. And therefore we're saying a vast amount of what economics attempts to explain, it's left out the fundamental causal component, which is the role of energy. And once you've got energy in there, then the laws of thermodynamics are essentially part of your economic thinking. And the best summary of those was a joke. I'm thinking of Kerouac as the name of the person who dreamed up the joke, but it may be Ginsberg. It was Allen Ginsberg who summarized the laws of thermodynamics as the first law was you can't win. The second law was you can't even break even. And the third law is you can't leave the game. And that basically says that you can neither create nor destroy energy. You simply have as much as exists. When you create useful work out of it, you necessarily generate waste, so you can't break even. The only way you could break even is find someone to dump the waste energy in the universe, which is the temperature of 0 Kelvin, which is absolute zero, and there is no such place. So those are the laws of thermodynamics. An essential part of us in terms of looking at production on the surface of the planet is that the waste we are dumping is going into the environment. And that is a very direct link between economics and ecology, which we really haven't had before.
So that's sort of like the terminal velocity, really, isn't it, on consumption? Because the sun is there, we can find lots of energy, but even if we find a way to perpetuate our energy needs, we still won't win because we've got to find somewhere to dump all the stuff that we're creating.
There's a beautiful paper. The neoclassicals, whenever I raise this paper, say, "Oh, that's so far in the distance, it doesn't matter." Yada yada yada. I'm sick of them using that excuse because they're the only bloody economic school that uses integrates the utility maximizing of a representative agent over infinity. So I'm sorry, guys, if you use infinity in your arguments, you can't say, "Oh, well, that's too far in the future." There's the paper called "Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist," where a prominent physicist met a similarly prominent economist and had a debate over were there any constraints to growth on the planet. And the economist basically thought innovation and technology would get around the problem. The physicists pointed out that even if you leave out global warming, in other words, if the base temperature of the planet was what it would be in the absence of any greenhouse gases, which is minus 18 Kelvin, 18 degrees Celsius below zero, that'd be the temperature if there was no greenhouse effect at all. If we're doing manufacturing on that surface, then simply by the second law of thermodynamics, about the amount of waste being generated to produce output, given this linear relationship between energy and GDP, which is part of the logic that I've got. Tim, by the way, makes it relationship between integrated GDP and energy, which is an important difference. Even if you just extrapolate forward, no greenhouse gases, I think in about 250 years, the surface temperature of the Earth would be hot enough to boil water.
Yeah, well, that'd save on kettles.
It'd save on kettles, it'd save on humans.
It'd save on humans too. Well, I mean, but isn't the reason behind it, and you can pick on that point about, what did you say, it was integrated GDP?
That's Jim's point. We'll come back to one. Yeah,
but let's get back to that in a second. But just, I mean, the reason why I think neoclassic economists will say, well, that's a problem for the future that we don't need to consider, is probably because it is so difficult to model, isn't it? Because you're looking at a lag factor in all of this, which economic models aren't so good at, is it? That the benefits we're getting today is going to impact variables in a decade or two, which is very difficult to model, I would have thought.
But it's also leaving out feedbacks. I mean, again, you would think these neoclassical climate models include feedback effects of the waste being generated on the capacity to produce. They don't include them at all. Now, what I'm saying is then part of the reason they've got into that mindset is they've had the Cobb-Douglas production function, labour and capital in, magic and bang, goods coming out the other side. It's labour and capital, energy processing and boom, goods coming out the other side. Therefore, you've got waste. You simply have to deal with the existence of waste. They've magic wandered away in their minds. And what we're doing now is saying, well, here's an absolutely integral link between energy production and waste. And therefore, you can't make that mistake of leaving waste out of the process, or thinking you can eliminate waste by the quick sort of pricing. You can't eliminate the second law of thermodynamics by getting your equilibrium price right. It's still going to be there.
So you're working on a model that's going to provide evidence behind all of this. I guess you're taking a lot of inputs, whatever you can, to develop this model. And how far along the line are you on that?
Yeah, not a great start. Only 1 week so far, because what we basically had was 3 people.
You've had a whole week. God, what have you guys been doing?
Well, I know, yeah. This is one of the benefits of what the NIESR grant is letting us do is collaborate, get together and just focus on just one issue for a week. Nothing else gets discussed apart from where we're going to go for a hike in the Utah landscape afterwards. So it was very, very productive in that sense. But this was the attempt for the first 3 of us to show what our approaches are. So my approach about saying energy is an input to labor and capital, and fundamentally it's the energy processing capability of machinery that explains GDP. Matheus has taken, and this is going to sound egotistical, he's taken what he has called the Keen model, which is my extension of Richard Goodwin's model with labor and capital fighting each other, to also include bankers in the mathematics. He's taken that as a foundation and built an alternative to the Nordhaus-style models that, rather than having a Cobb-Douglas production function and neoclassical concepts at the core, still uses the same damage functions they used, but uses the Keen model, which involves this cyclical dynamic between labor, capital, and bankers, and can have debt-induced breakdowns. And he effectively shows that under fairly realistic parameter values, if you have companies having to invest in energy, in pollution diminishing investments, then with a sufficient accumulation of waste in the environment, if they're going to borrow money to go and do that, they're going to go bankrupt over time. You'll have a what they call the bad equilibrium in the Keen model of effectively an infinite debt ratio, zero employment and zero wages share. There's another outcome as well, which is similar, which has zero wages share but still positive employment, which means total immiserization of workers. So that's the dynamic that Matheus has achieved working with Gaël Girard, in particular in France. And so he had explained his model to us. I then explained my approach, and then Tim explained his. And what we then decided to do was to start working on the Goodwin, the simple Goodwin model, the model that's the basis of the Keen model, which has output being divided by between labor and capital, and generate a model using my energy arguments. And we've got a reasonable distance in doing that. So we've got a Goodwin model now involving energy as the major input rather than labor and capital without energy. And it generates the cycles, et cetera, et cetera. We're now trying to fit it to data, and we're finding various curly issues in doing that. So that's the first week. So we hope to have a joint paper with a Goodwin model of energy production. And as well as with that, because we have energy the input, we have the gap between the energy input and the useful work achieved. That is the waste. So we've got a direct link now to the ecological issue. Yeah. And there's a question of fitting it to data.
Now, you made a good point about talking about Picasso, because at the end of all of this, what society really needs to do is shift to a point where we treasure quality perhaps more than consumption. And I love your point about Picasso, because you could have I had this vision of Picasso being approached by a neoclassic economist saying, well, this stuff you're producing is really good, but if you could turn out 10 or 15 paintings a day, then we could hit the market at a lower price and you get a much higher turnover. And Steve Keen would be standing on his shoulder saying, yeah, but look, he can only average 100 watts per hour. So, there's a limit to how many good paintings he can produce. And sort of like that's sort of like the economist approach to art, isn't it? Get the turnover, get the price right, and maximize your income as a way of doing that. But we are left with a load of shit paintings at the end of the day rather than masterpieces. And we need to sort of, perhaps society needs to think more about how do we create those masterpieces and lead a quality of life that is less I'm rambling, I know, but is using less. That is using less energy, but we're still getting the quality of life right.
You're onto an important point. This is a question of to what extent can output be decoupled from energy? In other words, what efficiency gain? Because you've got to have energy as the input. The question of how efficiently do you convert that energy into useful work? And that, if you imagine things like light bulbs again, then if you look,
it's not just useful work; it's actually quality of life.
But let's just let's put some parameters on quality of life. Quality of life for an incandescent light bulb was far higher than quality of life from a candle, because there's far more energy coming out of the incandescent light bulb than there was coming out of the candle. So you need 1,000. I imagine you'd need 100 candles to be equivalent to virtually 100 watt globe. It would be something of that order in terms of the amount of light emitted. But of course, an incandescent light bulb predominantly, as does a candle, predominantly outputs heat, not light. So the quality issue is saying, well, let's get down to the number of photons we need. And what we've done over time is go from the incandescent to the neon, to the I've forgotten the intermediate ones, those sort of wrapped up neon globes, to LED lights. And LEDs are now tuned to particular frequencies and are far more efficient, and can ultimately, after they've worked out how to get, I think, producing the blue light was the hard bit, I think. Blue or green was the real color challenge. You've now got LED lights which use far less energy to produce exactly the same the relative amount of lighting. So, but that efficiency gain is gone. We're not going to find anything more efficient than LEDs. And when you look over a whole range of manufacturing processes, the processes themselves are pretty much running at the limits of the laws of thermodynamics in terms of how efficiently can you convert energy into useful work and minimize the waste. What's the ratio there? But of course, like in transportation, a huge amount of the energy we produce is using moving objects that are far too fast, like cars, far too heavy, rather. Most of the energy is going to moving the device carrying what you're trying to move, not the device itself.
Massive waste. Yeah,
and they're also bumper to bumper, courtesy of bad road design. So there are efficiency gains, but fundamentally, what's been found is called the Jevons paradox. And this is William Stanley Jevons, one of the inventors of neoclassical economics, also did some useful stuff. He actually worked in the coal industry in Australia, of all things, at one point. And one of his insights was that if you find a more efficient way of using energy, rather than reducing energy use, you'll simply redistribute the energy elsewhere. So energy efficiency gains in some places have ended up using energy more in other locations. And overall, there has not been a decoupling of energy from GDP. And this is this is one reason that if you think about the level of optimism the three of us had, I'm the middle of the road between Matheus and Tim. Tim basically thinks we're going to go through a ecological collapse. We won't do anything to stop the problem until the thing falls over, and then whether we survive or not is a question of predator-prey dynamics, not a question of human ingenuity. Matheus is looking at all the policies we can bring about to try to improve the efficiency and to reduce the energy usage as well. And I'm sitting between the two of them thinking, I hope we do it in time. So it was an intriguing, not clash of philosophies, but clash of expectations about how much humanity can avoid the heat and energy problems, pollution problems it's got itself into.
So when do we see some out? We were talking about inputs and outputs, Steve. When are we going to see the outputs then?
Well, the first set of papers are likely to come out in the next 3 months. I've got to give two presentations in the next 2 months. One to the OECD on averting systemic collapse. I'm giving that talk in, I think it's 17th and 18th of September. And then the first of the NIESR conferences about their working groups. I'll get a paper there on literally the next 2 days in Edinburgh. So that'll be the first draft of these papers. And then the big thing we have to work on next time round is to work out whether we can make Tim's approach consistent with mine. And that's the important point to finish on this one, I think. What Tim has as his relationship is not between GDP and energy, but between wealth and energy. And what he talks about as wealth is the integral of GDP over time. So he then has a relationship between the integral of GDP and energy consumption, which means relationship with GDP and change in any consumption. And in his way of thinking about GDP, what GDP is effectively is growing a network, the network being the overall economy, making it larger is what we call GDP. Now, of course, it can get smaller. So in his vision, GDP can be negative. And I think that's an extremely interesting idea. And what we're really going to do is go through working the two different approaches, see the extent to which we can make them consistent, point out where the differences are. Is there a way, for example, to increase the depreciation rate in my model to meet what Tim gets as a relationship between the integral of GDP over time? We break down his idea of he doesn't distinguish between investment and consumption. He simply treats everything we do as what he calls big curly C, and that's the big curly C is the integral of all the activities we're doing over time, including what we call investment and consumption. Can we make the two to fit together and fit the data? He gets an incredibly tight relationship between change between the level of wealth, the integral of GDP over time, and energy consumption. And it's
because rich people consume more energy than poor people.
No, wealth in the aggregate level. This is what he's saying is what we're doing is expanding the wealth of the economy, and to get an increase in that wealth, a bit like for a child, the consumption of energy has to be greater than the output of energy. You've got to accumulate a bit of it. That's what gives you growth in a child. He said what we call GDP is fundamentally the same thing, growth in the wealth of the economy. Now, if you starve somebody, they can go backwards.
Right.
And then therefore you've got to basically live off the China in that sense.
Yeah.
And that's one of the dangers he sees with his model, which he calls No Way Out, and it's a publicly accessible paper. He explains the way he derived this argument about we're sort of waterfall of energy from an energy source of carbon-based energy down to society, and then from that down to the environment. Those steps, he explains the logic of deriving it, and when he fits it to the data between 1980 and 2010, he finds an incredibly tight relationship. I think of the order. I think it's about 0.07 milliwatts per American dollar. Something like that, when American dollar is standardized to 2010 prices. And the correlation coefficient's enormous, and the standard deviation's tiny. So he's got a very strong empirical support for his relationship between wealth and energy, and therefore between change in wealth, what we would call GDP, and change in energy.
Complicating that model even further, though, would be the issue about income disparity within an economy as well. Because if you've got a lot of very rich people in an economy, like let's take for example an American princess who's married into the British royal family, who preaches everybody about sustainability, but then takes a private jet to New York for a baby shower. You wouldn't get someone living in a council flat in Teddington, for example, using that sort of energy up.
And that's an important element of it as well, because again, you get the various mathematical distributions you can get that give you high levels of inequality, like log normal and power law distributions as well. And that can fairly naturally be added to an energy-based model, because based on the laws of thermodynamics, you do get that sort of energy distribution in particles. Imagine oxygen. If you imagine the air in the room you're in, molecules bouncing off each other, there will be those sorts of distributions and energy turning up there fairly naturally. So it's the thermodynamics thing gives you a much more natural link to inequality than the neoclassical does, and for that matter, the post-Keynesian. So there's lots of potential areas to take this research in. We just aren't going to get a huge amount done in 3 weeks, but we're going to get as much as we can done over that time.
Expecting you to solve all the problems of the world in 3 weeks, and we'd have a new way of operating, and world governments would be taking it on board before Christmas. Am I going to be disappointed?
Oh, damn.
I suspect
so. Sorry about
that. All very worthwhile. At least we're making some headway. Great to talk, Steve.
Welcome, mate.
It's important stuff, isn't it? Even if you believe that climate change is bunkum, as a small minority do, you have to admit it's hard to model the economy without understanding energy inputs and the feedback loops as we consume the planet's resources. Now, look, next time we'll be looking at the Bretton Woods Agreement. We'll be a bit late celebrating its 75th anniversary, but we'll look at what was achieved in that meeting all those years ago and whether we're overdue another Bretton Woods now, particularly telling as Donald Trump accuses various powers of currency manipulation. That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you then. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.